Well, hello everybody. I wish I was with you, but I cannot be, but let's hope that is soon. I want to share my screen with you and go through the themes that Tamara talked about. So here we go. Now, because the creative city idea is a positive idea, it tries to see the glass full, half rather than half empty. I'm going to say crisis as a time for culture, but also an opportunity for culture. And before the pandemic, people were asking, you know, where do we live? How do we live? What should we do? How do we connect afresh with nature? How do we connect urban areas with rural areas? And so this question of the future has been asked for a long time. And today, in a completely new level, with a different level of urgency. And I suppose what's happened is the hubris has been humbled. And that is what I think is one of the big lessons from the current moment. And what we can see is that our civilization is just a thin film of order we build around the chaos of events. So that film, which is there, has been shattered, and behind it, this is just one area a long, long way away in Hong Kong, or here is a car parking lot in the US. But these are the sort of chaotic situations we know, which are still, of course, there. And what that reminds us of is how fragile everything is. And this has become more apparent than ever just recently. And a friend of mine who's a visual artist put down the word lockdown rather than lockdown. Every 2 weeks he puts in a new word. But in fact, it's not only luck down, our luck is down, but also to some extent we created this, as many of us know. And when you're in the eye of the storm, of course, it's very difficult to think. And the patterns we know in this eye of a storm have been shattered, the things we were familiar with. And the question is, can we rebuild them? And also whether there is light at the end of the tunnel. Now, here is a mosaic, but around it, it has this corona. And this is the massive challenge for us. Can we put this mosaic back together in times of the coronavirus? But I think even before this situation, it was 1 minute before midnight. And if you think about it, you can probably see that our economic order is materially expansive, socially divisive, and environmentally hostile. And I remember, and I think all of us remember that saying by Bill Clinton, who said, "It's the economy, stupid. It's the economy, stupid." And he got voted on that. But perhaps today we might have to ask the question, is the paradigm the problem? Is our way of valuing what makes good places based purely on economics, or should it be based on health and well-being and being preventative or having a resilient place? All of these are big questions, but it certainly seems that there's going to be a radical reshift in what we regard as the paradigm within which we should operate. And most importantly for me, because effectively we're talking culture, 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 this is a cultural event, what can culture do, and what can we, and I include myself in this we, contribute to this situation? And here we have to look at, I think, culture in the biggest way, of course, that more big sense of culture, and also the narrow way, narrow, not narrow in a negative sense way, that represents all the forms of expression that we know about. So one of the things I found quite interesting is the responses you see. I saw this in Liège in Belgium, and it said capital is in chaos. And then the next thing, they said anarchy is order. I don't necessarily think all of that's true, but it's one of the responses. And the street is such a good place to see the responses that people feel about their daily life. So I'm always looking at graffiti. But also we can look at exhibitions. A year ago, I saw an exhibition in Mannheim, Germany, and it said, "The world we have constructed is a monster." Then it said, you know, die neue Sachlichkeit is one of these trends in art. It said the new reality. And then there was another one of these tents which said the emergency will replace the contemporary. And in a funny way, this had a lot of foresight, because this emergency we're in is the contemporary world we will be dealing with. And another exhibition I saw was in Berlin. And again, you can see these difficult contrasts. There's something bubbling underneath. There are many things bubbling underneath. And one of the things is, of course, this sense of fear we have. And I think one of the reasons we have this fear, this angst, is partly because obviously the world is shifting dramatically, digitization, all of these things. People are moving around the world more quickly, of course, not now in lockdown. And then how, with this angst, can you imagine, not necessarily a utopia which is perfect, but something that is better than just having angst? And there's a big and this is the cover of my book, The Civic City and the Nomadic World, and you can see this fracture in the middle. And I'm interested, and I think we all are interested, in how we heal this fracture. But the and I'm talking about here is that the world is turning to its darker face. We can see that in many political regimes. For example, this gentleman you know, and he always talks about the culture war. His strategic advisor at the time, Steve Bannon, said, "We are fighting a war of 2,500 years and we must win it." And the war they are both talking about is the sort of thing that I think you and your audience appreciate. You like the diversity of musics. You like the fact that we can move around and different cultures mix. It's that they do not want so much. And so one big message at the bigger level of culture is that transformation in general, and the transformation we might want, is a cultural project. So it's about values, obviously, and how we want to lead our life. So that's one dimension of this cultural question. And that leaves us with sort of difficult choices. Which way do we go? I mean, which culture are we going to encourage? The culture of being closed in, or the culture of opening out? And when I wrote the book, The Civic City, I discovered that when people feel relaxed and comfortable with each other, they open out. They join in with others. When they feel overwhelmed, and it could be through too much data or too much fake news or something, they go into their tribal zones. They go into their echo chamber. And perhaps this is one of the massive challenges we have. How can we talk across boundaries? And here we have this new moment. Again, to look at the glass half full approach, many people are saying, do not let this crisis go to waste, because it's been an opportunity for us to rethink some things fundamentally. And you know the sort of things we're trying to deal with, I'm assuming your audience is part of this we. You know, how do you create a circular economy, an economy that reuses resources, brings everything together again? How do you create a context where you can allow urban innovations to occur, where you can use technologies in ways which are focused on people and people-driven, or places which obviously are more healthy, more climate-proof? You can see all these little posters, and this picture comes from the We Make the City event that happens every year in Amsterdam. So one of the issues about all this is psychological. Now, I'm not all saying we should go to the psychiatrist, but we have at the moment three crises. We have the health crisis, which is urgent. Some of you people I've just seen there are very young, so you have less of a problem probably than older people. But the health crisis, Hopefully that will be dealt with in a year, 2 years, or whatever. We have an economic crisis, which is perhaps the biggest for a long, long, long time. Hopefully we deal with that as well. But the third crisis is very complex, which is the psychological crisis. Anyone who has lived through this moment will remember it. It's just etched into our mind. So there is that. That's a psychological problem. But the other psychological dimension is shifting, let's say, to the different sort of more sustainable economy and all of that, encouraging and acknowledging different cultures and diversity, is also a bit of a mind shift for many people. And within that is behavioral change and so on. I don't need to remind us all of Black Lives Matter. And it's very interesting. Black people have had problems with the police in America for a very long time. The Ferguson case a year ago. Now the question is, why did George Floyd, why did that instance become so dramatic? And I think it's partly because of that layer of fear that people have felt, feeling stretched and anxious. And that is perhaps one reason for the explosion. Now, another big message, I believe, is all of this has helped us to focus on things that really matter. Of course, different people think different things of what really matters, but some urgencies are very clear. And I remember a quote by a doctor, an Italian doctor from Turin, who was dealing with COVID cases. And he just said, I want to keep the memory of the moment I'm in, so I really understand what matters. And what he meant there was also that care workers are treated more seriously than before, rather than just saying, oh yeah, I need a nurse and it'll be okay or not okay. Who are the essential workers? Are they financial manipulators or people who care for us? That was the message he was trying to keep in his memory. And so to use this clarity, I feel is quite important to drive the energy of how we move forward. And this is something I'm going to say twice in this presentation. Let's not see the old normal as an exotic destination. Of course, we want some of that normality back, but it's not necessarily the exotic destination like the sunshine beach holiday in the Maldives. Another big message, perhaps, is this question of clarity and confusion. If I look at my own responses to everything over the last 4 months, I'm on the one hand a bit clearer about certain things, but on the other hand, very confused. And it's back to that point of how can I reflect when I'm in the eye of the storm? There's so much information. I can see so many things in the world, and I'm receiving a lot of information from people I think are so intelligent. I'm reading more stuff, and I'm overwhelmed. So my confusion comes from partly the overload, but also realizing it's clear that some things need to be done. But one of the things that is completely clear with a crystal clarity is that we are social beings. I know that's a cliche, and I know that sounds simplistic, but that is something I'll come back to in a minute. And of course, within that social beings context, of course, it's the power of art and culture and its capacity to connect, engage, all sorts of words like that, to share, do things together, and so on. Another message you could say is that the cultural arguments we've had, and many of you will have been involved in these cultural arguments, making them, saying, culture is important because, I've been one of these people who've been doing it for 30 or 40 years. And those arguments have often been about economic impact, the instrumental effects, and so on. We've often been quite scared to say, well, the real value of culture is actually these deeper things. But these are still true. Of course, it's cohesion, well-being, bonding, and all of these things which we need to do. And this hopefully will help us recreate resources for culture. Personally, at a personal level, some years ago, I decided never to do any projects anymore that says, what is the value of culture? Prove it to me. And I always say now, because the person who's asking you that question is saying, is putting you on the defensive, sort of implying that what they're doing is good. I now always say, it's not what the value of culture, it's what is the cost of not regarding culture. Because many of the explosions that we've seen, the social explosions, are actually cultural problems. I mean, Brexit in Britain was very much a cultural thing about Britain losing its empire and many, many other things as well. And you know, many will have heard Pierluigi Sacco. You know, he's a great guy, he's an academic, but incredibly clear. And he talks about three cultural phases, which you know. And the first phase is that traditional culture where we appreciate things in traditional institutions. The 2.0 is very much, you know, the creative economy and all of that. And the 3.0 one, he calls connection, the role of culture in connection and bonding and so on. So that's all fine. But I think, given that we have this crisis at the moment, a big message for the cultural sector is to reassemble the arguments for culture, putting them all together in a stronger way. And you all know, of course, the fourth pillar argument, i.e. when people talk about sustainable development or any form of development, they talk about economics, environment, and social. But of course, for me personally, culture is not only the fourth pillar, it is the pillar because it defines how we think, plan, act in this world. And so we're back to the point I just mentioned a minute ago. Not what is the value of culture, but what is the cost of not valuing culture. And that is embedded in this fourth pillar. And when we now think of recreating, because we've got a cultural catastrophe on our hands for many of those who need to depend on the market or funding things, we need to find new avenues to raise resources. And this point I am making here is obvious, but it's worth saying. Culture is, of course, how we perceive, express, and experience the world and make sense and make meaning. If we don't know how the world is put together and don't know how it makes sense to us, and if we don't know how we create meaning for ourselves, then we're likely to be lost. And this just reminds me of our sensory system, our smell, taste, touch, sound, look, the way we can see, feel, and experience. All of these things together are the essential ground of culture. Now, of course, everybody knows, and you know, because you've been all part of this story, is often we look at culture in these little, the cultural sectors now I'm talking about, as little fragments. Yeah, a bit of dance, a bit of this, and a bit of that. And then we could see that, let's say, in music production, there's a hell of a lot going on. There's graphic design, there's technology, there's sound engineers, there's so much going on. And when we add that all together and the people who are working in it, involved in it, we can see that it's been growing and growing and growing, not only in terms of jobs and so on, but also in significance and also in the way many people have seen that. And of course, in this moment we're in a different moment. Jobs are going down, incomes are going down, audiences going down, etc., etc., etc. I don't need to tell you that. And of course, we don't know how many people will have lost jobs. Of course, there have been initiatives like in Berlin, when they very rapidly, the Berlin bureaucracy is not renowned for speed and agility, gave, I think it was 20,000 cultural workers 5,000 euros within 48 hours. That's not going to get them through the whole year, but it's a beginning. But I think we also know that art and people in the art are resilient. And that resilience is obviously the strength they have. Now, when we combine this, and this is a good and a difficult story, with the massive breakthrough we've just experienced in the last 15 years, the breakthrough of a digitizing world, we see there are some opportunities. Of course, we all know that. Now, how do we think this through? In the crisis, of course, the digital that was already happening has pivoted. The digital pivot we're used to now, Zooming, all these other things, you know, let's go meetings, etc. All of those types of things have enabled us to see things differently and shifted how we relate to life in general, but perhaps urban life in particular. Clearly home working, again, many people have worked from home for several years, but the degree to which it's happened now, you all know, and I don't need to tell you that, has exploded exponentially. And that shapes what's going to happen in cities, because if I work in Warsaw, the centre, every day, I want to live relatively near. If I only work there 3 days, I can move a bit further away. If I'm only going to work in Warsaw 1 day, it doesn't matter that I live in Krakow or wherever, Gdansk or I don't know what, Kielce. It doesn't matter, of course. And that will have effect, because cities will not fragment, but the places, towns around them will become more desirable. And in this becoming more desirable, partly because people have seen in the lockdown that you want a garden. Can you buy a garden place in the middle of Warsaw? With difficulty, you have to be rich. 100 kilometers away, you probably can have access to a garden and nature. And I think one of the big lessons from the pandemic has been this reconnection to nature. And this, I think, will shift how spatial patterns operate in geography. And that, I think, will lead to the rise of the local, more locally driven things. And that will also affect event structures and suburbia. Suburbia and the local, these other areas, will want urbanity, because one of the reasons, obviously, for the centre is the buzz. So they will want to create some version of the buzz. They won't replicate Warsaw, they can't. But they may be satisfied within that because it gives them a better quality of life. Now, what that will imply is a whole sort of rethinking of planning. And that rethinking of planning also goes for the city centre. Clearly, even though people might social distance at work, you don't need that much office space. Now, that may be an opportunity for the young, because you're going to have to turn these offices into apartments, into interesting, I suppose, cultural places. There'll still be incubators. They might operate differently and so on. So planning will change and shift, and the way we deal with the outdoor. You'll think of the inside spaces, intermediary spaces, which might become much more important because they're covered in winter and so on, and then outdoor spaces that are okay for summer. But anyway, this is all possible because of the digital pivot. And we all know, and you know, that rarely has there been something that has had such a gravitational pull that sucks everything into its orbit as has the digitizing world. And in that sucking into the orbit, of course, this is just a representation of the world becoming a smaller place. It's allowed us, obviously, to be connected in all sorts of ways to information and other things from everywhere. But the interesting thing about it, and this has been so confusing, and this is why the pandemic has been quite interesting, because it slowed things down, because that shift to the digital and its volume, velocity, and the variety, which leads to what I'm calling here the anytime, anywhere, any place phenomenon. You can be here, there, everywhere. I hope I'm roughly with you in Warsaw. If any of you that are there in Warsaw, I feel I nearly am. But that rushingness has actually partly slowed down, and some of that slowing down was probably positive. I don't want to talk about mindfulness, but it's just allowed people to not be too obsessive about certain things. And nevertheless, even though physical travel is reducing, and I think it will at some point increase again sharply, what you really understand, we all understand, is the new mobility is the digital. The digital is the new mobility, not necessarily the trains, planes, cars, and so on. And what, of course, that does, it reshapes the civic, because it then reminds us, where the hell do I belong when everything is on the move? And this is a very difficult issue. It is, let's take Berlin as an example. You've got all these outsiders coming in, you've got the insiders. And then the question is, what is my identity? Is the person who comes from outside as important as the original initial Berliner and so on? But what is happening in these places, you find quite often, is perhaps this notion of creating civic structures, of sharing and all of these things, but the sharing economy itself has elements that you could define as civic because it's ways of people communicating and bonding. Now, it may not be that we all rush to the airport like here in London. And in fact, it's this, the digital, that is the connector, and the civic is versions of this digital thing. But nevertheless, all the sort of work, research and so on shows that place matters as never before. And so this question of blending the combination of local space and cyberspace is really interesting. And I remember the first time about 18 years ago or 20 years ago in Helsinki, I was in a cafe. Helsinki, of course, very advanced. We were sitting in a cafe and the table was partly a digital screen, and this was the first experience for me, was actually sharing coffee across the world with various people. And there'll be new versions of this, which will be much stronger than Zoom. There'll be many innovations that are being thought of this very moment, to really try and bring across the mood, the experience of physical space. But this is a picture from Rotterdam, in the hotel New York, New York. And already then, you can see this can happen already, because these people are socially distanced. There's games they can play. There's various things that can happen in this, in one way, very ordinary place, but in another way, extraordinary place. And so what I'm saying in the end, and this has happened over the last decade or so, is how we think of place, space, and time has completely changed. And these words are very easy words to say: place, space, time. But we're operating in different time zones simultaneously. We're in different time zones, places, geographically, and spaces. But we're also sitting down somewhere, or we're doing it on the move. And there's this fluidity. I think this fluidity, the fluidity, many people call it liquid modernity, is something, Zygmunt Bauman calls it that, is a reality that we're all in. And what it leads to is very interesting things. And I'm just giving you the Zifferblatt example. You'll know the cafe in Moscow and also in London and so on, where, for example, you don't pay for your food and coffee. You only pay for the time you're in that place. And there are many examples of this approach of taking time, for example, in this case, as a currency. I'm only using this example to show how time and space and place are changing. Now, obviously, you know, everybody knows culture is digital, because there is a digital culture and its own inventions, imaginations and techniques and so on. So the culture is digital, but the digital is culture. It's obviously all the same thing. It's an energy, it's like electricity that flows through the system. And if I think back to the first time I sent an email when I was very young, I couldn't imagine the paradigm shift that we were going through. And this shop in Edinburgh just reminds me, because it says there, paradigm shift changing the way we look at the world. So another switched question, just like culture, what is digital digital, but what is not digital, and how do we adapt? And this raises questions I'll come to in a minute about performances and all of that, and analog ways of dealing with things and just being together and so on. But that is an interesting question. Now, if you put all of this together, we all know, you all know, that we're in the midst of redesigning the world and all its systems. And it needs a vision, of course, of where next. And this is a moment, I mean, many people, well, some people I've been communicating with are all addressing that problem. We're discussing it, not that I necessarily know the answer, and you will have your versions of this. So where next? Where next? Where do we look? Clearly, it's not about digging the holes in the same old way, but it is just trying to see ahead, which of course is not easy. And post-virus rethinking, I mean, one of the things, and I know you know this, is it's been the biggest inadvertent experiment we've ever had in climate emissions reduction. We didn't know that we wanted to do that, but suddenly it happened. Suddenly that you could hear the birds singing. Suddenly you could breathe fresh air. Suddenly you could do lots of things. You've seen the maps, of course, of those emission reductions. It can reassess the impact of the arts. Quite clearly, the arts has been such a bonder in this difficult period. It's obviously, as I've discussed already, accelerated that digital turn. And it shifted how we work and socialize for the moment. But I'd like to come back in a moment to that question of socializing. But it's also created a sense of grief, perhaps, and loss, the losses that were in urban life. But again, it might allow us to reassess that. The overcrowded events we've often had, where you couldn't hear the other person speak. You never know. Perhaps with slightly less people, perhaps a conversation with 10 people is more meaningful than just being in a crowd of 100. And then we're back to this exotic destination thing. What we've got here is a whole set of urgencies that we need to assess again, because they're already there. Now, you probably all know about Earth Overshoot Day. That's the day in which the Earth uses the whole resources it needs to replenish itself. So in an ideal world, it goes on forever. However, in 2000, that day when we used all of the resources as if it were one world was the 23rd of September. In 2019, it was the 29th of July. They're just making the massive calculations to see that it moves from July back to August because we've used less resources, there's less pollution, there's less problem, all of that. So this is a very dramatic thing in general. I mean, if one just thinks about that, we know we need to change the way we operate. We've already discussed the nomadic people moving around or trying to move around now more digitally. We've discussed the digital. But so many of the problems, of course, are the wicked ones. The wicked problem is one that you can't address on its own. And many people have been discussing recently that, for example, you can't look at transport just as a transport system. You have to look at it as transport and health and jobs and social life and all of these things together. So all of this implies having a much more holistic view of how you deal with problems. Now, that's not to say the specialist is, I don't know, whatever, not useful. Of course they are. But the main way of looking at it has to be in that more holistic way. And what it raises is the tried and tested in this very departmental thinking, will it work? Can it work? The answer is probably no. And again, I'm back to this picture of this fracture. Because of these fractures, these fault lines and fragilities, I'm just using all words beginning with F because I like it when everything starts with one letter. But you get the point. These are the big questions that I think actually culture helps in. It helps in this question of people feeling fragile. It gives them perhaps confidence and things like that and makes them feel okay. It can address, I don't know, the environmental challenge by doing something artistically that makes us think and so on. But in general, we know we're in the midst of a systemic crisis where a business as usual approach will not help us get to where we want to be. So that's where we come to the plan B point. What's next? Now, one of the big issues is between the young and the old. Now, clearly, it's the old that are getting more affected by the virus. And some critics have said, hey, we've only done this lockdown because you're worried about the old people, and it's the old people making all the decisions, and they've forced all of us young people to go into lockdown, even though we're hardly affected by it. I mean, that's a very dramatic way of putting it. But if you think of post-pandemic places, I think the young will lead the return. And the young will actually do it. This is partly to do with testosterone, of course, because of that urge to connect with other people. But it's this wish to gather together in some form. And then also because they, if you're thinking about the new mobility patterns, are more likely to use micromobility. I mean, Warsaw is largely flat. So, it's not like Lisbon where you have to get an electric bike and go over cobblestones, which is very difficult. So they're much more in tune with some of the new developments. And this is where I talk about that question of density, as I did before. Perhaps being together with 100 people slightly separated might be better than being crowded in with 400. And so what you've got there is one final point, is whether there is a vaccine. Now, SARS has not got a vaccine 18 years later, and anyway, that's just a point. Now, if you get a vaccine, the pent-up energy that you can see in the illegal raves and so on is going to burst out dramatically. So this may not look like this. This, as you know, is Milan. This is New York. The streets will obviously be different again. But it may be that the offices, this is a typical corporate office, look like that. There's hardly anyone there. But that's when you might make apartments out of them because the cost of managing that is too much. But if you look at Station F in Paris, it's obviously a really interesting place. You can see you can create configurations where social distancing is possible, but you still feel you're part of the community. So what's interesting here is really the design challenge to that. But at the same time, I think what will happen is, this is Venice, the ghetto vecchio, because the first ghetto in the world was the Jewish ghetto in Venice in 1450 or something. You will get more and more, I believe, gated estates where you probably will be tested whether you've got the virus before you're in them. But one of the big issues, or the big issue, is really, can we wake up to this new morality, and how does it affect the way we combine and live together? Because this question of proximity is more than just clustering, creative industries, companies, and so on. All of that's absolutely clear, and you know a lot about that. I don't need to elaborate on proximity in that sense. But it's really this human yearning. I looked at some report about what happens if you don't touch a baby. And I don't want to talk about this experiment because it was so negative, because the child grew up and then was unbelievably unhappy and committed suicide. So there's this human urge, as we know, to touch, to feel, to bond, to connect, to meet, engage, network, be intimate, hug, embrace, caress, any other word that you want to add to this list, and please send me some more words, I'd love that. But I think, because human ingenuity is quite strong, there will be creative innovations that will allow this to happen in one way or another. We've already seen it here. These are familiar pictures from Italy in the crisis. And I think also in this urge to connect, our art of conversation may get better than what it says in this picture. So often conversations are just me, rather than, hey, what's interesting? I'm curious about you, or so on and so on. But I think what we will see is blended experiences, many more blended experiences, and those will be obviously also with blended audiences, and I'll show you an image of that in a second. But let's look at the cultural forms and their worlds and how we might think what's going to happen. Visual arts, performing, design, film, the digital and museums and so on. What's going to happen there? Now, in terms of visual arts or writing, that sort of stuff, I think making of it's broadly fine. You can write a book at home. You can do it in a studio on your own. You can distribute it actually okay in reality. Museums, I think, ultimately will be okay as galleries. There'll just be less of them. Selling, for example, in the visual arts, has been surprisingly okay. You know, Art Basel online, all of those things, those fairs online. But it's okay if you're known. If you're selling, you know, I don't know, Gerhard Richter or Pablo Picasso or any name you know, you don't need to physically see the picture. The problem is the young who are not known, because those you want to meet and connect with. Now, clearly, the social networking thing is less easy than before. The discussing it is probably a bit curtailed because, you know, events might be a bit different. And obviously, the experiencing of all of this visual arts environment, you know, if you're a place like the Biennale, it's got some buzz about it. That, of course, will not be there. So perhaps writing okay. This is my friend again. This is one of his most popular words, dyslexia, badly spelt. He's okay, he can do that. Public art will be okay. This is Anush Kapoor sculpture in Chicago. Making craft things, this is where Damien Hirst makes his stuff. It's just around the corner from me, 3 kilometers away. And obviously seeing pictures in galleries will probably be okay in this more isolated way. But here is an art fair, and this sort of art fair, I think, still will re-emerge again. And there is already discussion about them not only being online anymore. But it's really when we think of the performing arts that the problem is really big, music performance. You might be able to make it in a studio, all of that, that might be fine. You know, you're in a bubble with your friends, you know them, distributing it, right, probably okay. But actually it's the seeing, obviously, and the experiencing it together. The selling, possibly okay, and can still sell T-shirts and online. Discussing is probably okay. Now, let's see about the experiencing, and I want to come back to that in a moment. So this is the famous thing that happened in the Barcelona Opera House thing. That will be more of, but it's not the same as seeing. But Simon McBurney, one of our greatest actors, who runs Theatre de Complicité, said, the crisis offers an opportunity to reshape culture. It's possible to think of a new way. What does this mean for theatre, he said. He's an amazing guy. He also lives around the corner from me, by the way. He said, I've got no fucking idea. And I think that's great at one level. But actually, he did have an idea. He did a performance called The Encounter, where each of you had to wear a headset. So although normally it's the audience theatre combination that is so powerful, because of having these earphones on as he was performing and you were seeing this Amazonian head trip, I thought that was amazing. So it depends. Theatre will innovate, and he, in fact, did himself innovate in a sense. But whether you'll get this is, in fact, I live in a sort of small place, and this is the local, in theory, hit place. This sort of event may not be quite in that. There are lots of Berlin music people here speaking, Klunderkarnichen, Tresor, all of those Berlin nightclubs came to my small place to discuss that. But that will be probably more difficult. And indeed this, sorry I'm being so personal, but I might as well be personal. This is my daughter flying in the air. Her circus was cancelled. that is going to be really difficult because that is so physical, so physically connected with the performers. So there are some amazing difficulties, and particularly, as you know, from the performer's point of view, in a performance, you give yourself up to an audience, you give yourself to the audience, and the audience, of course, wants to feel the other audience in it. And of course, there are the transitional solutions that you know of, the football ones, where you have cardboard or digital visitors, and that in its own way is absolutely fantastic and pretty innovative. But I think you probably know about the innovations that are now on the move. South Korea and Phantom of the Opera is just an example. South Korea didn't go into lockdown, and Phantom of the Opera performed as before with the same amount of people. There were no social distances performances because they wanted to address the cultural catastrophe. How did they do that? You can only get into the theatre because there's an airlock. It's already, the infrared camera has already tested whether you have signs or symptoms, and the temperature is taken remotely, so you're already far away from entering the theatre. And I'm just giving some examples. There's much more about this. Self-cleaning antibacterial door handles. Lots of tricks about when you touch things self-cleaning so the virus doesn't stick. And then the obvious thing about using hand sanitizers. Now this, to me, is unbelievable when we think this through. And I think it's really interesting for us to look at what's happening in South Korea in this regard. Perhaps you know it all. Anyway, and then obviously these types of performances are probably okay because they're distance. But what I found interesting about the South Korean example was that a version of this, which we see here, is possible. I'm not sure about this version. I can't predict that at all. Now, when we look at film and design, TV and so on, design already is largely digital. Filming is actually, there are obviously crowd scenes, but you can simulate those digitally and all of that. So I think the actual filming and then obviously displaying it is absolutely fine because we can still watch a video or a film or however we do it on our tablet or whatever. And the experience of it, I think, will be increasingly versions of augmented and virtual reality and extended realities sort of mixing up together in one way or another. So that's a word or two about film and so on. But the virtual reality things will still be there. This is Art Electronica in Linz, where this can still be created without people being too close together, and you can go into these spaces, and they normally only allow a few in any case. And here is another one in Japan, all of which I think is still possible. But many of these examples are not that visceral, wonderful example of just grabbing someone, hugging someone, touching someone, and all of that. And this is why I keep on saying the young will lead the way, because they're going to be less frightened of it, and if they get the virus, they're less affected. But overall, I would say, all of this needs rethinking the rules and regulations. Every pandemic, I'm thinking here perhaps of the cholera, which then we saw the cholera was connected to water. That changed how cities works. Sewage systems were created. It began to deal with new forms of health and safety. So there'll clearly be, the rules of health and safety will be different. So that's why the inside buildings may be more difficult to have the crowds than the outside, which may be less controllable. But I think there's a massive task of inventive and imaginative rule-making and incenting making that should be undertaken. And as we well know, one way of looking at this, if you think about what are the great culturally creative, livable, put any words you want onto this, places, you feel anchored in them. That could be the local place. Anchored in the sense that you know the physical place. You feel you belong here. And obviously we can belong in a number of places. You know, someone can feel at home where they originally came from, as well as, for example, in Warsaw. But it's also a place of possibility. And I still think possibilities, of course, are still available, but we're needing to adapt, and we're obviously just doing it. I think it's the connection and networking that's going to be really difficult. You know, the things that you can do on more advanced Zooms where you can randomly connect with people virtually, or another platform is Let's Go Digital, or what's the other one called Hop On, etc., etc. That's simply not quite the same. Although I have noticed in Zoom calls, I've occasionally seen someone I've always wanted to talk to, and just on the chat function done a private message, we're going to have a quick chat. And funnily enough, I found that quite rewarding. The other thing that I found quite rewarding, back to possibility, sometimes I thought, oh, do I want to go to this event? Okay, I'll go there. It takes me a day. And then perhaps it wasn't ideal. Nowadays, sometimes I go to an event and I think, thank God I didn't go to it. I was there for an hour and a half and that was great, but I didn't have to leave my home. So there are two sides to this. But nevertheless, it's this networking thing that I think is difficult in terms of the physical. Clearly, you know, great places where you can learn and so on. And that means this wandering around the city will be probably different. And then this question of being inspired. I think there are already many forms of inspiration. I think there will be many ones in the future. But it's back to my own obsession, and we've been doing something which is about how you change the rule systems for the new world. And we've been organizing for 2 years the Creative Bureaucracy Festival in Berlin. And this year's it's on again. We're doing it virtually, and I love many of you. You can register free. There's a lot going to be going on. You can download stuff, etc. And so that's more or less it. So I think we'll need these young bureaucrats who reimagine with the innovators in the world how to create this different place and space that creates a lot of meaning and satisfaction for people. So thank you very much.